Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be here today in celebration of two new novels, The Dove in the Belly and The Crocodile Bride. We are joined tonight by Jim Grimsley and Ashleigh Bell Pedersen, and our moderator tonight is Carter Sickels. So first, I will introduce Jim. Jim was born in rural eastern North Carolina and was educated at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His first novel, Winter Birds, won the Sue Kaufman Prize for the best first novel from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and was a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award. He has published other novels, including Dream Boy and My Drowning. His books are available in Hebrew, German, French, Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese. He's also published a collection of plays and most recently a memoir, How I Shed My Skin. His body of work as a prose writer and playwright was awarded the Academy Award in the Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2005. For 20 years, he taught writing at Emory University in Atlanta. We were so lucky to have him in our fair city and so glad that he gets to be back home in North Carolina. And yeah, so glad to have you here. We consider you a longtime friend of Charis. So.
Oh yeah. Been there many times.
Yeah. And we're joined tonight by Ashleigh Bell Pedersen, whose fiction has been featured in News Stories from the South, the Kenyon Review, the Iowa Review, Design Observer, The Silent History, A Strange Object, and the New York Public Library's Library Simplified. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Pittsburgh. She resides in Brooklyn, where she writes, acts in theater and film, and attempts to teach her dog, Ernie, proper leash manners. We were just talking about Ernie. Ernie may make an appearance. We can only hope. The Crocodile Bride is her first book. We're super excited to get her on her tour. She is getting to do a hybrid tour, so in person and virtual, which is great.
That's really great.
But we're really delighted to do this part of the virtual tour. And our moderator tonight is Carter Sickels, another longtime Charis friend. He's the author of The Prettiest Star, which is published by Hudson Press, and the winner of the 2021 Southern Book Prize, also the Weatherford Award. The Prettiest Star was also selected as a Kirkus Best Book of 2020 and a Best LGBT Book of 2020 by O Magazine. His debut novel, The Evening Hour, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2012, was an Oregon Book Award finalist and a Lambda Literary Award finalist. Was adapted into a feature film that premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival. His essays and fiction have appeared in a variety of publications, including The Atlantic, Oxford American, Poets and Writers, BuzzFeed, Joyland, Guernica, Catapult, and Electric Literature. Carter is the recipient of the 2013 Lambda Literary Emerging Writer Award and earned fellowships from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Swanee Writers Conference, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and McDowell. He's currently an assistant professor of English at Eastern Kentucky University. So welcome to you all, and welcome to everybody watching at home. I want to encourage folks, if you would like to ask questions, feel free to put them in the ask question box or in the chat, and I'll be sure to move them over. But we also love for you to chat out where you're watching from if you'd like to see that. I see some folks are already doing that, which is great. But in general, just make yourselves at home, get a good snack, and put your feet up and enjoy these stories that we're about to hear.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it is great to be here with both of you. And, I was saying earlier, Jim, I've been a fan of your work for such a long time. When I was an undergraduate, in the 90s, one of my teachers introduced me to your work. And I think I started with Winter Birds and then devoured Dream Boy. And it was probably the first time I'd really read about gay characters in rural settings. And, I was just, it really changed me thinking about what I could write about. And I was just mesmerized by your prose.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I'm so excited about your new book, The Dove in the Belly. Is just beautiful coming of age about a queer young man in the 70s. And I think also portrays a complicated picture of queer romance. So I'm happy to be here with you and Ashleigh. I'm so excited to meet you. For your debut novel to be out in the world. I read Crocodile Bride last summer, and I was just, blown away by your lush descriptions of this world and how you balance this, the violence with this like lush imagery and beauty. So,
thank you so much.
To you both. I know I want to hear you both read, and I'm sure the audience members do too. So if you just want to give if you need to give a quick setup and read a page or two from your book.
Sure.
Ashleigh, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So just, well, first of all, Carter, thank you so much for that really lovely intro. Just to give a little bit of background, this novel was a 10-year labor of love when all was said and done. So from 2012, when I started it, all the way up until it came out in the last couple weeks. The novel is about a little girl named Sunshine Turner growing up in a fictional village called Fingertip in Louisiana. It's a community of outsiders primarily. So it's not about the various incredible cultures in Louisiana so much as it is the people who have sort of landed there and find themselves somewhat isolated. So this covers several generations, but the main protagonist is Sunshine herself, who's 11 years old. She is about to turn 12, and this is the summer that both her own body starts to change and some traumatic things happen in her life that she has to cope with simultaneously. To cope with these things, she turns to a mythical story about a woman in the woods who has healing hands and a crocodile, the only crocodile in Louisiana. There are alligators, but not crocodiles, so far as I know anyway. So she turns to this myth to help her get through this summer. So I'll just read a little bit from the very beginning of the book. This is chapter 1. It's called Staying Modest, June 1982. Sunshine was standing waist deep in the lake when she discovered the stones trapped inside her chest, one behind each bare nipple. They felt raw and tender in the cold water, so she stood and cupped her palms against each to soothe them. And that's when she felt them there, two strange, tucked away treasures. Aunt Lou hated the word nipple and instead said buttons when she had to call them anything at all. She also hated the words fart and anus, and for some reason, nostril and toenail clippings. JL said these words whenever she got the chance, just to get on her mother's nerves. Always at great risk, Sunshine thought, since Aunt Lou did not like it when JL got smart. If Sunshine's own nipples worked like real buttons, she could unfasten each one, pluck out the misplaced stones, and pocket them for safekeeping. But even through her goggles, she could see, too, that the nipples themselves were bigger. No longer buttons at all, but two pink, puffy mounds. Underneath were the stones, and she could push them back and forth a bit, just like with her kneecaps. Only her kneecaps had been there all along, and these stones were what JL would call une surprise. Speaking French was another way for JL to annoy her mama. Aunt Lou insisted that JL and Sunshine never mistake themselves for Cajuns. The Turners, she said, were swamp people only in proximity and not at heart. JL only ever replied with a mournful oui, and pretended to take a drag of a cigarette. The morning was swollen with humidity, like overripe fruit about to burst. On their walk to the lake, steam had curled off the grass that grew in the ditches along Only Road. They'd crossed into the woods and strolled single file down the path, carrying towels and cans of ginger ale and peanut butter sandwiches and the half-deflated yellow inner tube. Blue stem tickled their bare legs, and the pines smelled sweet. As they walked, JL had said, "I'm glad it's just us. I like it when it's just us." And Aunt Lou pretended to react with shock. "My daughter saying something nice? Sunshine, call a doctor." By the time they reached the lake, JL was ignoring them both. lips puckered like she'd sucked on a sour wedge of a lemon. Instead of playing beauty pageant or swimming with sunshine, she'd flopped back on her towel and declared she was going to get so tan that the pale skin underneath her freckles caught up to the color of the freckles themselves. "I'm going to be one smooth color by the end of today," she said, closing her eyes. "Like caramel." Aunt Lou told her that this A was impossible and B would mean Joanna Louise should be careful what she wished for, as her freckles were a bit on the orangey side. "Might wind up an Oompa Loompa," Aunt Lou cautioned. Now, as Sunshine stood in the water, confused and excited by her discovery, JL was still lying belly up on the nearby shore, roasting in the sun. Sunshine squinted toward her and saw something else she hadn't noticed before. JL had breasts. 2 apple halves beneath an olive green bikini top. Little green hills on a flat, pale landscape. Nearby, Aunt Lou swam past, legs kicking, long freckled arms wheeling slowly backwards. The sky was a watery blue. If Aunt Lou wasn't around, swimming her slow backstroke in wide circles around Sunshine, she could go and plop on the sand next to her cousin and ask her to look at the nipples, to feel for the stones. JL could tell her what they meant and what they were called and whether or not Sunshine should be worried. I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
And so we'll hear from Jim next, and then I will start in with the questions and conversation.
Great.
All right. I'm going to read from the beginning of a chapter late in the novel. The novel is about Ben and Ronnie and their love affair. This is a point at which they've been separated for a while. So Ronnie walked out of the house onto campus. Silver dark, lights bursting, a fog like a movie set, a feeling that it would rain, followed by rain, drizzle, mist, the finest distillation of water as he followed the brick path. He would lose his nerve. The sensible plan made no sense, but he would never be able to wait. He was too sore inside. He was hoping for something and trying to kill the hope, breathing in and out, first past the business school, then in front of the domed library, a few people out, walking as he did without an umbrella in the bits of rain. The path felt so familiar. How late was it? Late enough. The football team had a curfew. He would go, he would. He was afraid, but he would do it anyway. So past the bell tower into the forest around Keenan Stadium, where he had come so faithfully, so pathetically every Saturday when there was a home game, sitting in the stands, looking at that tiny figure, shoulder pads and knee pads, helmet, the number all anybody could see from that distance, but there he was, darting in and out, leaping, diving toward receivers. Hardly any of it made sense. Why would Ronnie go to the game to watch? Why torment himself when the space between them had gone dark and silent months ago? Anyway, the images tumbled regular as his footsteps tonight, wet pine straw on the bricks, leaves slicked and wet. He was descending the hill now, the squat brick form of Teague Dormitory through the trees, the scattered lights of Avery, the hill still descending, past Bryson Field, floodlights dark, the baseball diamond covered, grass of summer in hiding. And how many times had he walked this way, looking up at the balconies of Airing House, counting the floors and the windows to find the room where he used to live. The drum in his chest, the beat that drowned out everything, blood rushing, the rain falling heavier now. He had to keep moving no matter how wet he was. Into the lobby, empty, the snack bar closed. He was dripping, but in the elevator he felt calmer, took a deep breath, rode up to the lobby, and then there it was. He was on the balcony, all quiet, and walked to the room. Anybody could see him now. Taped to the door, a picture of Ben, a sign that said, Planet of the Apes. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I could just sit here and listen to you read all night, Jim. Yeah. Well, thank you both.
Well, we can get together later and I'll read you for an hour.
Well, I'd love to just start off the conversation by each of you kind of talking about the impetus for your book. You know, what drew you to this story and compelled you to write it, or what was the inspiration for your novel? And
I'll go ahead. I'll start.
Yeah.
There were a couple moments along the way. The very first seed just began from a late night of hanging out with friends in Austin, Texas on a porch and drinking copious amounts of wine, if we're honest. And a friend of mine telling a story about her childhood, about specifically the place where she grew up, which was, to use her words, the middle of nowhere, Florida. And it was in a little place that didn't have a name. The people in the village sort of made up their own name for it. And I was really compelled by this place itself and by the setting she described. Again, it was in Florida, it wasn't Louisiana, but it sparked something in my imagination. It was just so rich feeling. And she also told me the story about some of the people she grew up with there. I think what happened is something in what she told me hit a nerve inside of me that I wasn't aware of. I started off the book writing about a middle-aged gay man, which it ended up being a story about all women and particularly a little girl. But for the first 2 years, I thought that this story that she had told me and this character that I had really connected with, I thought that was the story. And it really evolved from there. And I think what the process of writing was a process of excavating that nerve that had been struck sort of subconsciously, and discovering what I was actually writing about. Pardon me, my phone is going off. I'm going to ignore it. Discovering what I was actually writing about, which was about a little girl and about women and women's stories. And it turns out not a middle-aged gay man. Something much more relatable for me, personally, a woman. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I love to hear you say that, because it's like, you know, the struggle for me and for so many writers is like kind of figuring out what the story is, and that like process of discovery. And I also just been writing something for 2 years that I thought I realized it's not going anywhere, but I think I had to write it in order to get to the, you know, the project I'm trying to write about. But
yes, definitely. It was, it was the first 2 years of floundering, and then I figured it out at some point, and then, you know, spent another 7 or 8 years kind of.
Right.
I've certainly had that happen.
Yeah.
Really.
They're all different. I mean, every book, you think one's going to be hard and suddenly it turns out to be easy. You think one's going to be easy and it suddenly turns out to be hard.
Yeah.
With this book, I sat down to write one night and started a scene in a boarding house, you know, one that had actually happened to me. My family suddenly moved out of state and I had to very quickly find a place to live, and heard about this boarding house, went there, found out somebody needed to let their room out for the summer, and I rented it, and I rented it. And I took that moment and fell into Ronnie, and all of a sudden this fellow named Ben came into the story, and they had this amazing conversation that drew me into their relationship, and I couldn't type it fast enough. This, you know, that usually doesn't happen, but this book sort of just fell out. It insisted. It didn't take very long to write the first draft. It was a terrible first draft, but it was, you know, it was, when I got it done, I had the basis of a very good book, I thought, and I've had that feeling all the way since. I just love these guys. I love this story.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Dream Boy. It reminds me of that relationship between Roy and Nathan.
Yeah.
I feeling to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so too, Jim. How long, do you know how long it took you to write the first draft? I'm just curious.
Me too.
It was obscenely short. I remember it as being about 4 days. I couldn't type. Like I said, I just couldn't type fast enough. But I tell you the truth when I tell you how dreadful it was, because basically what I did was type down their conversations, and with a little bit of connective tissue between them, and I hurried it took me a couple of years, more than that actually, but I don't want to confess to how many, to to fix the problems of writing so fast. But it worked. At the end of all that, I had a book, and I was very grateful for it.
Yeah, and the characters are so rich and memorable. So I love novels with a strong sense of place, and this sort of build is like coming of age in the South. Place is important for both these novels, the geographical place, but also the era, right? The time period. Yeah. Both of you live, or I guess Ashleigh, you'd have lived in the South or from the South.
Yeah.
And write about the South. Can you talk
Where
about
are you from, Ashley?
I'm from Virginia.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
How does the setting or sense of place like inform your writing, or how does it sort of function in this novel?
So for me, sense of place is kind of everything. I'm a very visual person and a very sensory person in terms, in general, I think, but also just in terms of how I write. Yeah, I just felt like I could really sense that in your writing when you were reading aloud, Jim. So imagery is often the sort of starting point for me, and it's kind of what I follow, and imagery is often, kind of comes along with a sense of setting. And so Fingertip itself, really, that was one of the gifts of the novel that, again, sort of sparked initially by some of the descriptions my friend had given me from her own childhood in Florida. But it also, Fingertip really kind of bloomed to life in my mind in this way that, sort of like Jim was describing with this conversation, that was the gift of the novel, and something that took 10 years start to finish to get out there. Fingertip itself was really kind of alive in my imagination from the start in ways other components were not. So even when the main character was different, the sense of place was really quite vivid, and got more so as I did some trips to Louisiana and researched more about the land there, and came to have a sense of, the types of trees and the history of the land there and how it had changed over time. It all kind of further informed my sense of place. But yeah, for me, it's really like kind of everything. If I can feel grounded in place, other things can happen in that setting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to hear from Jim about that too, just because that imagery of the rain was so rich.
Well, this was set in Chapel Hill where I went to school, and what I really wanted to do was pay homage to those years of my life, because getting away from my parents and living on my own was just a wonderful thing to do. My childhood was pretty rough. So when I got to Chapel Hill, I finally had a space that I could control. And I loved that city utterly. And I loved getting caught in the rain. I walked everywhere barefoot in those days, and I could feel the rain and the pine needles under my feet when I was writing. I wanted to evoke every bit of the Chapel Hill that I adored when I was there, and that made the whole. And that was a layer that I had to add after I got the baseline of the story down, because I knew all that stuff. I had to follow the story. The story was outrunning me, and I had to chase after it. Mm-hmm. And so but I was confident about doing it, because all I had to do after that was go back and add in the pictures, add in the stuff that I was, sort of doing in shorthand in the beginning. Mm-hmm. But I really loved that kind of writing, and I loved what you read. I love the sensory evocation of a moment in a particular place. It's not just place in general, but it's place in terms of moment and where they are and what they're seeing and what they're smelling. Mm-hmm. That's what's important to me as a reader. Mm-hmm. And that's what seduces me to read. So I think I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do too. And that, that kind of leads into a question I was going to ask later, but I'm going to ask it now, which is just about both of you, your command of the prose. You both write so beautifully. And Ashleigh, as we've talked about, your imagery is so kind of lush and vivid. And Jim, yours is so clear and this kind of spare lyricism. And like the section that you read, but also I have to tell you the ending, like the last chapter was just so incredibly moving. And that last paragraph, like I had to read it aloud to my husband. It was just so perfect.
Thank you. I really work on last paragraphs.
Yeah, it's so great. But like, can you talk a little bit about the work each of you do, like at the sentence level? You know, how do you find that rhythm, the details, the language? Do you read your work aloud? You know.
Oh, I'm so curious to hear from Jim. Jim, do you want to take the lead on this one?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Reading aloud is the key to it, for me. Although I don't need to do it as much as I did when I was writing my first books. But there is a point at which when I really want to know whether I've got the right rhythm, the only way to know that is to read it out loud. The way it feels in the mouth is what matters so much. And I really love the rhythm of long phrases. I'm a Virginia Woolf nut. I love, long, elaborate sentences. And that's what I emulate whenever I sit in front of the computer.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be afraid. You can't be afraid. You just have to throw yourself into a sentence and hope that you're going to find an end for it, right? Because the kind of work what I heard in your writing and what I do is you throw yourself into the images and you've got to follow where they lead, but you have to do it in a way that lands you somewhere at the end of a sentence.
Oh yeah, I well, am I interrupting you, Jim? I don't want to interrupt you.
No. I was hoping you would pick up.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm nerding out over here about this whole conversation. I also am a huge Virginia Woolf fan. I went to the Lighthouse at least twice, maybe even 2.5 times. I don't think I ever made it through the third time in the pandemic. I couldn't stop reading.
To
the Lighthouse. It's just so I just love her so much.
She's
she makes
just
me want
so good.
Oh my gosh. Wonder. I know. Just amazing. So I also think reading aloud is key. I had a teacher in 6th grade who I actually thank in my acknowledgments section, and I'm not sure. I hope she's still around. I don't know where she landed, but she taught me to fall in love with sentences. She had these really she taught us sentence diagramming for one thing, which I don't remember anything about, but I think it did teach me a lot about just constructing different types of sentences. And she also had us do these really concrete exercises. Like we would have to write, we always wrote in a journal. We had to write in our journal and then go through, and she wouldn't let us repeat in one paragraph the first word of any given sentence. Every word had to be different. And I think it taught me something about rhythm and about the use of repetition versus accidentally repeating something and how that can kind of either kill or elevate a rhythm. I think that my love of music and of poetry and just other forms of art also has seeped into writing, and my understanding of like the, way the pitch of a sentence can rise and fall. I just love it. It's my favorite part. I think writing fast, like Jim, you were saying, first couple drafts of my book, I wrote very quickly, and that was a necessary part of the process. But when I got to the point where I could really just dive into language and where the voice started to lead the story as well, that was like, that's the best. That was just like,
really.
It's like singing.
You're an actor, did you say?
I do. Yeah, I do some acting. That's actually why I moved to New York. Yeah. Although I've been pulled back toward writing more recently, so I haven't been pursuing it as hard.
That getting the words in your mouth, actors make very good writers. I'm a playwright also, and I've done acting and performing.
Yes, cool.
So So I find that actors have a great instinct for writing because they spend so much time speaking beautiful language.
Right.
So you've got that rhythm in your head already from all the stuff you've done, I'm sure. I mean, it's cool.
Yeah, I can see that and feel that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm so glad we're all big Virginia Woolf fans. I too back to her work, and Mrs. Dalloway is one that I read and reread, and you can just pick it up and like look at any page and find some gorgeous sentence.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes, so lush. Yeah.
Of course, I mean, if you get too discouraged by how good she is, you can read Flush and see what she's like when she's a little ordinary.
Oh, interesting. I have not read that.
Okay, me either.
That's her biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's little Cocker Spaniel dog. And even Virginia Woolf can't manage to elevate that quite.
That's funny.
That's
that out.
great.
Well, I also wanted to just, I was thinking about the tension in your work, and because you've both written very different kinds of novels, but this the love of the language, the sense of place, and the characters, and the tension, and there. And Jim, in your novel, it was like this palpable tension that kept me turning pages because there's this tenderness between Ronnie and Ben and love, but there's always this sort of element of danger and kind of weakness to Ben. And I found myself feeling really worried for Ronnie and nervous.
I did too.
How Ben might explode, or hurt him.
Yeah.
I felt empathetic toward Ben. So I'd love to hear you just talk more about their complicated relationship and kind of how you find your characters' humanity and depth, what brings them to life on the page.
Oh, Ben was a terrifying character for me. And all the way up until the very last paragraph, I was writing that last chapter wondering, is he going to come back? Is Ben going to show up? But the thing about Ben was, no matter how scary he was, there was always a core of him that wanted what was happening between him and Ronnie to go forward. And there was something about the process of their being with each other that brought out a side of Ben that Ben probably didn't know much about himself. Mm-hmm. And he was fascinated by it. And that's what, so I had to kind of sit in there and feel him out. Mm-hmm. I think when you're building a character, you've got to have a whole sense of them so that you know why when they're speaking, they're using one word rather than another, or there's a particular grammatical error that Ben makes in speech. And the copy editor kept trying to get me to change it. And I kept saying, no, that's how he talks. It's got you can't get to the point that you think you're actually hearing voices in your head, because then you need help. But you need to go as far toward that as you can, because you have to have you have to have such a firm sense of who they are that they can tell you what they will or wouldn't do. Right? Mm-hmm. So.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever think about writing from Ben's point of view, or did you?
No, it's always, I like a book that's got, to get that page turning quality, you can't move from one head to another so much. You've got to find one point of view and stick with it.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you described him as terrifying, because he kind of terrified me as well. But as you said, there was just like a vulnerability, of course, with him kind of dealing with the decline of his mother and the grief that comes from there, you know.
If that hadn't happened to him, I don't know if this relationship would have worked. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I still don't know how long it'll work. I mean, it has a feeling to me of something that's very intense that will burn itself out.
Yeah.
As relationships did in 1978 and do now.
Right. Well, I'm still hopeful for them, but um,
Yeah.
so Ashleigh, I'll shift over to you. I mean, I was impressed by how you manage all these different characters and follow this, several generations of this family. And a major part of your novel is about this cyclical violence that men in the family are perpetrating, and how trauma is inherited, and that generational trauma, and how do we find a way out of that. And it's very much about the violence that Sunshine experiences. So can you talk, I don't know, about that, and about your choice, like how the choices you made in writing directly about that violence, and still being able to find some sparks of lightness, that you could bring to Sunshine's character and to the narrative?
Thanks. Yeah. Finding the whole sense of the character was very important to me. I think, gosh, I have a lot to say about that, so I'll try to rein it in somewhat. But I think anytime I started to write a character who was too sweet or too monstrous, they started to not feel real. And there was one exception with one of the characters, John Jay, who is pretty monstrous. And I think that can happen in the world. I think that some people in their adulthood are, in fact, monstrous.
Yeah.
But I also think that many people who do monstrous things also have a sense of humanity. They were children at one point in time. That exploring, for example, who Billy was as a child is part of what really enabled me to understand him and have some degree of empathy for him, despite the monstrous things that he does as an adult. And so much of what Jim was saying was really resonating with me, where at some point, especially when I got to the last scenes in the book, they almost wrote themselves at that point, because I felt like I knew the characters so well that they were running the show by then, which is another gift in the writing process. It takes a lot of work and a lot of time with those characters and writing scenes where they don't feel emotionally true, where they, initially Billy did just kind of feel monstrous. And I really struggled with that, because I was like, I don't think he is. I think he has a human, he's a struggling human. But sort of finding that sense of humanity took a lot of years. And then again, by the end, the scenes were kind of writing themselves amazingly. But it took a lot of work to get to that point where I knew them well enough that they were talking.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, how did you? I mean, your structure is pretty complicated. How did you kind of? And because you also have these embedded stories of the crocodile, like the folktale around the crocodile. So how did you kind of find that structure? And
I mean, through many years of work, a lot of it came about organically. So there was a sense of us like weaving through time from the early drafts, and that became really important to me because I was dealing with intergenerational trauma and the way these previous generations issues were trickling down into the present day. That sense of like an intertemporal relationship within the actual structure of the book became very, very important to me. But actually making it work so that it wasn't, I was okay with a reader being somewhat disoriented, but I didn't want to totally turn my reader on their head. And so finding a way where you can go back and forth without completely losing the narrative or the characters was a challenge. And it took a lot of work. And in the final draft in the summer of 2020, right before my agent sent it out on submission, he had asked for a few changes, and I wound up kind of seeing all this other stuff I wanted to change about it. And one of the things was a final pass at the structure. And so I have this picture of my dog walking over all the pages of my novel, which I had, Jim, I'm curious if you've ever done anything like this. I tend to do well sometimes with manual copies. So I broke the novel up into sections and I spread it out like a crazy person over my living room. And, Ernie, the dog, trampled over it occasionally. That was the way it was actually getting a visual and just going kind of nuts one night on rearranging everything and looking at the transitions and And I had done that several times before too. So it's a weird, a lot of like actual work to get it to work in the way that I wanted it to.
Well, I actually edited this. The final rewrite I did of this, I did by hand on paper, which is the first time I've done that for years.
Wow.
Because it made me focus on it in a different way. And I actually saw a lot of things in that last write through. That's when I actually got the true ending. I mean, the original ending was different and much weaker than this one. So yeah,
Wait.
I've never actually had to spread it out over the carpet. But I do know writers who do that because they've got to see the sections of it. But you would, my book was a fairly simple, starts and it ends. I mean, that's the structure of it. I didn't have to, and it's that point of view that did that. Because I didn't switch points of view, I didn't have to worry about the major transition that is. And I've had to deal with that in other books, but not in this one. So.
Yeah. So wait, did you say you wrote out by hand the final draft?
Not wrote it out by hand, edited it by hand, and that meant I added a lot of pages at that point and moved things around. So it was considerable. It was more writing than it sounds like. It wasn't just corrections. It was, replacing one scene with a brand new scene and replacing the last 50 pages of the book.
Wow.
With a different 50 pages.
Wow.
So
yeah.
That work is so good to me though, because it's so surgical. When you're rewriting at that stage, you've got the book, so you can beat it up, right? You can change it. You can lay it out on the floor, and it's still a book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's something very comforting about that, and everything you do feels like it's making the book better if you're on the right path.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I love talking process and hearing about how you work. And I also just wanted to remind people in the audience that you can type in any question you have in the ask question box, or just type it in the chat. Because we have about 15 minutes left, so
gosh,
please feel free to ask questions. This kind of like
conversation.
Process. I mean, you both are incredibly creative, like beyond writing fiction. Jim, you are a playwright. You also write. You've written a memoir, published a memoir, short stories. You've published, I think fantasy novels, and you've done a lot of work with plays. And I know, Ashleigh, I think that you're a painter and also act in plays. And I'm curious, like how. Because I feel like I just write fiction. I don't have any of those other real talents, but how you balance that different sort of creative work, and if you can, work on those projects at the same time, or if you sort of separate that, and also how they kind of inspire each other, or maybe give you insight, into your.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. Did we lose Jim? Is Jim still with us?
No, I'm here.
You are. Oh, my little screen is out for some reason, but okay, great. I'm glad you're there. I mean,
I'm not leaving.
Okay, good. Oh,
now I lost Ashleigh. So
can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. I can't.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, that's weird. I lost myself.
Yeah, Ashleigh, we can hear you, but your camera's gone off.
That's so weird.
Very weird. Oh, there you go.
There you are again.
Okay.
It just got tired.
Yeah, well, I'll say a couple words about this. I also am so curious to hear from Jim about this. I love the playwriting connection. I have been thinking a lot about the way that these different creative pursuits play into each other. When I got into painting, I had just gone through a personal hell. Basically, I had gone through cancer and chemo treatment and radiation and all of that. And I was finding for a really long time that I had always been interested in acting and I'd always been interested in writing, but I was finding that words were not available to me to talk about what I had experienced. This also, to add insult to injury, I guess. This was in the pandemic. So it was the start of the pandemic, was the start of my cancer diagnosis, and then kind of went through all that craziness during that time.
Wow.
So I moved away from writing for a while because I was actually very frustrated up until pretty recently that I couldn't find the words for what I had been through. I couldn't find the words for the grief that came along with going through something like that. I couldn't even process. I mean, the processing, I'm probably still in it to a certain extent. The processing of something like that and of the pandemic itself it's just kind of running its course. So I turned to painting, which I had only ever done a little bit of, really as a way of expressing something that felt nonverbal or that I couldn't find the words. Eventually I did start to find the words for it, and I've been writing more and more about it. But painting really offered this way of just this pure emotional self-expression and finding meaning in all of that insanity in a way that words just couldn't do. I just wasn't quite ready to find the words for it. But I've also been noticing, like, I have these things ebb and flow. I really wish I could just do all of them at once. It drives me crazy that I can't seem to act in a play and also write and also paint, but I guess I'm not a robot, so I can't do it all at once. So I'm trying to just kind of roll with the way it all seems to ebb and flow and kind of come into my life in different ways and for different purposes. And then just one final note on that. I mean, acting and painting, I think, are very much about being seen and letting myself really be seen. And writing, for me, is much more of a retreat and quiet kind of process. Yeah. Just me, myself, and I. And in some ways, a lot more comfortable for that reason. Not always, but so it ebbs and flows. I moved to New York for acting, and I really haven't been pursuing it as hard as I had imagined myself doing. I think I've been kind of returning to writing again.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, I turned to playwriting at a point. I was writing Winter Birds, my first novel, but I wasn't able to get anybody to pay any attention to it. And I had moved to Atlanta because I knew a lot of theater people there. And what they were doing was very exciting. I had been living in New Orleans before that, which is a wonderful city, but I was afraid I was going to drink myself to death there, because the liquor was cheap and plentiful. And you could go anywhere with it. But in Atlanta, I started hanging around with theater artists, going to see plays. I saw some new plays, and I thought, well, that wasn't very good. And that started making me think, well, what would it be like to try to write a play? And I was at a place in my fiction writing where I was writing less and less dialogue in the fiction. And I thought, well, that's probably not a good trend. So I thought, well, if I tried writing a play, I would have to face... I had a sort of fear of dialogue at that point. And I thought writing...
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, writing the play cured me of that, but it also told me that dialogue doesn't work the same way in a play that it does in a book. Because, the dialogue's got to carry the whole weight of the story in a play. But it opened me up to a side of writing that I would never have discovered otherwise, because playwriting is public. It's not private. You've got to have a community that will help you do a play. You've got to get them to read it with you. You've got to leave holes in the play that other people are going to fill up for you. You can't try to make it complete. It's got to be a scaffolding. And the scaffolding has to be made of events and dialogue. And it just was, it was revelatory because it satisfied the part of me that wanted to be in public. So that when I want to be private, I write fiction, right? And that's very internal and very emotional. And then the plays are much more idea-oriented. And so it's a good balance doing the two things.
That's really...
And then the acting was just an accident. So, But I figured if I was going to write, I needed to know what performing was like. And I really liked it. But I drew a line between me and that. I only did a certain amount of it because I didn't want to be eaten by that. I was already being eaten by fiction writing and playwriting, and I didn't want to be eaten by acting. And I felt the lure of it. It would have been very tempting
Yeah, so
to
fun.
live there. Yeah.
Jim, have you ever adapted any of your own novels as plays?
No, I have adapted a couple of other things, but not my own novels. I have allowed other people to do that. I don't want to do it. You know, I've already written it,
Right.
and I would, and I feel like it would be a bad idea for me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with this book, I'm tempted to try something, but I probably won't. There are too many. I've got half a dozen novels in my computer that I need to finish. I just stop working on them when they're not fun or when I, don't know what's going to happen next. And, I don't have that much time left. I'm old. So I think that's where I'll probably put my energy.
Yeah. I could see Dove in the Belly as a play, though. I think it would really.
Yeah, I think it would be a good one.
Yeah.
Or movie. There's a movie producer out there for this.
Yes. Yeah. This is interesting too, since you both do have experience in plays and in acting. And I was kind of thinking about audience, because that's something, people would ask me when I first, with my first novel, and it was something that I hadn't really thought about when I first started writing fiction. But I do think about it more now, not so much in the process of writing, but I am thinking about, like, who do I want this book to go to, or who is the reader that I want to kind of touch with this. And I'm wondering if either of you have that kind of, I don't know, an audience or person, or like, who is your ideal sort of reader for these specific novels?
For me, it's a teenager who's going through, or at the point of going through, some of what Ronnie's going through. Because there's so little there was, when I was a young reader, so little out there for teenagers, especially gay teenagers, to make them feel comfortable with what's in their heads. I mean, you mentioned Dream Boy. I think that was one of the very first gay books about a rural setting. I mean, I was tired of reading about, you would think all gay people were born in New York, right? Or in San Francisco. And they went to, their first act as a 4-year-old was to go to a gay bar. It was, there was this kind of barism to the 70s and 80s in gay fiction. It started to branch out very shortly after that, but it was, I wanted to see me. I wanted to see a country boy. I wanted to see a Southern boy going through those things. And I wanted to, the reward for that was hearing from teenagers who read Dream Boy and said, this saved my life.
Absolutely.
I didn't know who I was until I read this book. And it was a very cool experience. So that's why the other reason I wrote this book was I wanted something happy to work on during the pandemic. That's why I think I refused to have anything but a happy ending. Because I just didn't want to be depressing over this last 2 years.
Yeah, I hear you. For sure. And I think, and I think like that of course there is more sort of fiction now about queer characters set in rural areas, but it's still very, heavy in urban spaces. And I think that young people, even though they have such kind of access online and on the internet, they're still really seeking that, they want to see that kind of representation, or to feel like less alone,
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, that's kind of a cheat. It's not really, for me, it's not a rural novel if they immediately move to New York in chapter 5.
Doesn't count.
Those are good books. Now that experience, the urban gay experience, is vital. So it's good that all those things are there.
Yeah, for sure. What about you, Ashleigh, with your
Oh yeah, I was lost in hearing you all talk about that. So it's interesting because when I wrote this book, it was very important to me to not think about audience. I actually purposefully tuned out the idea of anybody reading it. I found it so stifling to the creative process. And so I would imagine myself sometimes writing in a tent in the middle of the woods, and I had a rule where I didn't have to leave the tent at all, or I didn't have to walk out of the woods until I was ready to. And that was essential for me in finishing the novel. Now that it's out in the world, my hope, I think very similar to what you all are saying, is really, I think my hope is for women to read it, and for people to, some of the themes that are really important to me in the book are specifically around finding our voices and putting words to return to that, putting words to our experiences and being heard by other people. And if this book were to resonate with someone in that sense and help them find something that they need to say, or put words to their own experience, either in front of another person or just for their own self, that would be, the ultimate meaning. For someone to just see their self in your work, it's an incredible feeling.
It's harder to picture an audience for a dark, violent story. I mean, I think you kind of defend yourself. You have to defend yourself in the course of doing a work like that. I mean, my first book was a lot like that, and I never thought about who the audience was for that book.
Interesting.
Right.
And it didn't, it struggled to find the right audience. I had, even when I was searching for agents, a lot of the responses were that it was too celebrate like that, or it's too dark. And somebody
I got 8 years of that with Winterberg. This is the best book I've read that I'm not going to buy in a long time. Right. This is the most depressing book I think I've ever loved.
One agent told me she was a huge fan of my writing, but could I change the plot? It's like, no.
Oh, I just love that. Could you just be different?
She was not the right one for me. More power to her, but it wasn't a fit.
I had this moment when I was at SIBA when I'd written Dream Boy, and it was following Winterbird's here, and this lady was in a line to get her book signed, and she had this look on her face, and she looked at me and she got this furrow in her brow, and she said, "Is this book?" And then she stopped, and I said, "Yes, ma'am, this book is every bit as depressing as my first book was." And she burst out laughing, and I burst out laughing.
That's great. So sweet.
Love that. Well, I think we are almost out of time, and it's been so wonderful to talk with you both, and really lovely conversations. And I encourage everyone to go out and buy these books, because there is some darkness, but also real beauty and joy in both of them as well. And just so we will bring ER back. But thank you both.
Thank you so much, Carter. Thank you so much, Jim, too.
Yeah, thank you, guys. That was great.
Yeah, it was so fun.
This was such a delight. Thanks to all three of y'all for such a robust conversation, and the craft stuff I think really is helpful to so many people. So I hope we've got some writers watching, because I know I really enjoyed that. If folks do not yet have these books, I know that you're going to want them now. So click this teal button and it will take you, there you go. It will take you to the page where you can buy all of these books. It really does help Charis when you buy the books directly from us. So thank you for doing that. Check out do y'all just real quick want to say a little bit about each of your presses, because I think it's great for folks to know about these smaller indie presses.
Yeah, I'll start. I'll just sing Hub City's praises for a second. When I was writing this book I had zero experience in the publishing industry outside of publishing short stories. So my big dream was to get a spot with one of the so-called Big Five. I'd had a friend who'd published a book with Simon & Schuster, and I was very envious of that. And then when my agent is the one who suggested Hub City, and there were a few things that have just kind of blown my mind, and they're not paying me to say this. I just can't describe to you how much I love this press. I'm sure Carter has plenty of good things to say to you. But a few things, I feel like they really respected me as the authority on the story. There wasn't, and it includes difficult subject matter. So for people to really respect what I had written it was very meaningful. I felt so seen and heard, and like the work was really seen and heard. They also, they're such a tiny press, but their whole thing is that they're tiny, but they behave like a big press. I have found that to be true. I mean, they got a review in the New York Times for this book. Like they have it out there in the world in this way that I never knew small presses were even capable of doing. I just didn't know anything about that world. You know, you just think you want the big press and that's what will get your book out, but it's not so. It's been a beautiful experience. I truly count my blessings for my agent getting this book in their hands like every day. It's just been, I just love them so much. That's what
I ditto all that, just about Living Corrido. This was my first time publishing in the young adult arena, and when Arthur was talking to me about the book, he told me they weren't the least bit afraid of trying to sell it both to adults and to young people. And he got the book, he got me. It was an extraordinary experience. The beauty of a small publisher is they can't afford to take your book if they're not going to push it and make it get out into the world. And that's what these guys do. They're 3 years old. They're really making their presence known. And I think it's a beautiful company. And I'm really proud. I'm more proud of this book than I have been in anything in years.
And, you know, from a book selling perspective, both of those presses are a joy to work with. So it's all the way down. You know, it's really cool. It's really a pleasure to get to work with those companies. So I think it's helpful for folks who might be prospective, hopeful writers out there to know, like, you can publish with some smaller presses and still have your book be a mainstream success and all of that. It's totally possible. And I think that's exciting because Carter, your book was certainly a mainstream success as well with Hub City. So
yeah, they're incredible. Just in getting the book out there and also just taking a risk on it and caring for the book and caring for me. And, you know, I had a sort of similar where the Big Five, like, you know, it was too dark. Or I think one editor actually said, like, why do we need another story about the AIDS epidemic, you know? And so I was so happy to find Meg and for people who really got it and understood me, like what I was trying to do on the page, you know?
Yeah.
So important.
That's sad to hear, but that's the way, especially the bigger houses are.
Yeah.
It's very sad, but that's why we're all here.
Yes.
Real stories. So I'm delighted that we got to have this night. I hope that y'all get to have a little fun this weekend, maybe take a little time off and stay safe and well. So
thank you.
Stay away from them hot dogs, though.
That's right. On that note, y'all take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.